October 26, 1944, Philippine Sea, off the coast of Samar. 06:58 hours. The morning sun broke through scattered clouds as the officer of the deck aboard the USS Johnston, DD 5557, scanned the horizon with his binoculars, the salt spray stinging his face as the Fletcher-class destroyer cut through the Pacific swells at 25 knots. The smell of fuel oil and cordite still lingered from the previous night's operations, mixing with the sharp tang of the sea air that had become as familiar as breath itself to the crew who had lived aboard this steel home for 18 months. Then, through the morning haze, silhouettes began to materialize, massive pagoda-like superstructures that could mean only one thing. 4 Japanese battleships, including the Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, along with 6 heavy cruisers and their destroyer escorts, were bearing down on the vulnerable escort carriers of Taffy 3, the small carrier group that Johnston and her sister ships were tasked to protect. The sound that defined this moment was not the roar of engines or the crash of waves, but rather the almost ceremonial tolling of the general quarters alarm, a sound that transformed the destroyer from a vessel in transit to a weapon system whose 2,100-ton displacement was about to challenge warships 10 times her size. Commander Ernest Evans, the Johnston's commanding officer, made a decision that naval tactics textbooks would have called suicidal, but that his crew would later describe as inevitable, given the man who commanded them. Without waiting for orders from the task force commander, without coordinating with other destroyers, Evans ordered Johnston to attack, to charge directly at the Japanese battle line, to close to torpedo range against battleships whose main guns could annihilate his destroyer with a single salvo, to accept what seemed like certain destruction in exchange for buying time for the vulnerable carriers behind him. The sound of Johnston's 5-inch guns opening fire reverberated through the hull as the destroyer began engaging targets at maximum range, each shell a statement of defiance, each shot an announcement that this American destroyer would not run, would not hide, and would fight regardless of the mathematical certainty of the tactical situation's outcome. What the Japanese commanders observing Johnston's charge could not understand was that they were encountering not just a destroyer, but rather the physical manifestation of American naval culture, of tactical doctrine that emphasized aggressive action over preservation of force, of leadership that valued initiative over adherence to doctrine, and of crew cohesion that transformed individual sailors into a combat system whose effectiveness exceeded the sum of its components. The destroyer racing toward their battle line should have been an annoyance, a minor threat to be swatted aside by superior firepower before continuing toward the primary objective of destroying the American carriers. Instead, Johnston would become the nexus of an engagement that would force the Japanese to withdraw from what should have been an easy victory, that would cost Japan strategic opportunities they would never recover, and that would establish the Fletcher-class destroyer as the most dangerous American warship in the Pacific, not because of overwhelming firepower or impenetrable armor, but because of the combination of technical excellence, tactical flexibility, and human determination that these ships embodied. To understand why the Fletcher-class destroyer became the warship that Japanese naval forces learned to fear above all others, one must first comprehend the evolution of destroyer design and the role these ships played in the Pacific War's naval campaigns. Destroyers had originated as torpedo boat destroyers, small, fast vessels designed to defend battle fleets from torpedo boat attacks. By World War II, destroyers had evolved into multi-role combatants capable of anti-submarine warfare, anti-aircraft defense, shore bombardment, and surface combat against both capital ships and other destroyers. The Fletcher class, of which 175 were built during the war, represented the maturation of American destroyer design, ships that balanced speed, firepower, survivability, and operational range in a package that proved extraordinarily versatile across the Pacific's varied combat environments. The Fletcher-class destroyer displaced approximately 2,100 tons, was armed with five 5-inch dual-purpose guns capable of engaging both surface and air targets, carried 10 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple mounts, and was equipped with depth charge racks and anti-submarine weapons that made them lethal threats to submarines. The ships could achieve speeds exceeding 35 knots, had operational ranges exceeding 5,000 nautical miles, and incorporated damage control features and compartmentalization that gave them remarkable survivability despite their relatively thin armor. These technical specifications were impressive, but not unique. Other navies built comparable destroyers during the war. What made the Fletcher class uniquely dangerous was not its specifications, but rather how American naval doctrine employed these ships and how American crews operated them in combat. The Japanese Navy had entered the war with excellent destroyers. The Fubuki and Kagero classes were fast, heavily armed, and operated by crews whose torpedo tactics and night fighting capabilities were superior to American equivalents in the war's early phases. Japanese destroyer doctrine emphasized offensive torpedo attacks, with tactics refined through years of training, and with weapons, the long lance torpedo, that were superior to American torpedoes in range, warhead size, and reliability. Japanese destroyers achieved significant successes in the Guadalcanal campaign and in night actions throughout 1942-43, inflicting losses on American forces and establishing reputations as formidable opponents whose capabilities American forces learned to respect. But the tactical and operational context of the Pacific War favored American destroyer characteristics over Japanese equivalents in ways that became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. American destroyers were designed for sustained operations across vast ocean distances with fuel capacities and crew amenities that allowed them to maintain operational effectiveness during extended deployments that would have exhausted Japanese crews. American destroyers incorporated radar systems that provided detection and fire control capabilities that were superior to Japanese optical fire control, particularly at night, and in poor visibility conditions where Japanese advantages in crew training were negated by technology that made targets visible regardless of human visual acuity. American destroyers were produced in quantities that allowed them to be employed in multiple roles simultaneously: screening carriers, conducting anti-submarine patrols, supporting amphibious operations, engaging enemy surface forces, while Japanese destroyer numbers declined through attrition that Japanese shipyards could not replace. The sound that became symbolic of American destroyer effectiveness was the distinctive crack of the 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose gun, a weapon that could fire at surface targets or anti-aircraft targets with equal effectiveness, that had a rate of fire exceeding 15 rounds per minute per gun when well-trained crews operated them, and that delivered high-explosive shells that could devastate unarmored targets and damage even heavily armored ships when hits were achieved at vulnerable points. The 5-inch gun's sound, sharp, percussive, rapid, when all 5 mounts fired in quick succession, became the acoustic signature of American naval power, announcing the presence of destroyers whose firepower was sufficient to threaten any target and whose crews were trained to deliver that firepower with accuracy that Japanese forces learned to respect. Commander Evans aboard Johnston exemplified the leadership culture that made American destroyers so dangerous. Evans was a Naval Academy graduate and career naval officer who had commanded Johnston since her commissioning, who had trained his crew to standards that emphasized rapid response and aggressive tactics, and who had internalized a leadership philosophy that prioritized action over caution when combat situations demanded immediate response. His decision to attack the Japanese battle line without orders was not reckless, but rather reflected tactical judgment that recognized the strategic imperatives of the situation, The carriers had to be protected, the Japanese had to be delayed or disrupted, and waiting for coordination would have wasted critical minutes that could determine whether the carriers survived or were destroyed. The engagement that followed Johnston's initial attack demonstrated both the capabilities of the Fletcher-class destroyer and the limitations that physical reality imposed, regardless of crew determination or tactical skill. Johnston closed to torpedo range while under fire from multiple Japanese heavy ships, launched her 10 torpedoes at ranges where hits were probable, and observed at least one torpedo hit on the heavy cruiser Kumano, inflicting damage that would force the cruiser to withdraw from the engagement. The destroyer then engaged Japanese heavy cruisers with her 5-inch guns, scoring multiple hits that caused visible damage and fires, demonstrating that even light guns could inflict meaningful harm on heavier ships when those guns were aimed accurately and fired rapidly by trained crews. But the Japanese had overwhelming firepower advantages that no amount of tactical skill could negate indefinitely. Johnston absorbed hit after hit from Japanese heavy shells, with 14-inch and 8-inch rounds striking the destroyer's superstructure, penetrating the thin hull plating, and starting fires that damaged control parties fought even as they continued to man weapon systems and maintain combat capability. The destroyer lost power to several gun mounts, suffered casualties among the crew, and gradually lost speed as engineering spaces were damaged and flooding compromised watertight integrity. Yet Johnston continued fighting, continued maneuvering to avoid Japanese fire, continued engaging targets until the ship's combat capability was completely exhausted. The Japanese officers commanding the ships that were engaging Johnston and the other American destroyers that had joined the attack expressed surprise and frustration at the American destroyers' effectiveness and persistence. Japanese after-action reports noted that American destroyers attacked with determination that bordered on suicidal, that their gunfire was accurate and sustained despite being under fire from much heavier ships, and that the disruption caused by these destroyer attacks, the need to maneuver to avoid torpedoes, the distraction of engaging close-range threats, the psychological impact of being attacked rather than conducting an unopposed approach to defenseless carriers, had contributed to the decision to withdraw from what should have been an easy victory. The Japanese had expected American destroyers to maintain defensive positions around the carriers, perhaps launching torpedoes from long range before withdrawing, conducting the kind of prudent defensive action that would have allowed Japanese forces to brush aside the screen and destroy the carriers. Instead, the American destroyers had charged. They had attacked as if they were battleships engaging equals rather than light ships engaging vastly superior opponents. They had inflicted damage disproportionate to their size and had created tactical confusion that multiplied their effectiveness beyond their actual combat power. The Japanese had destroyed or severely damaged several American destroyers during the engagement, including Johnston, which eventually sank after sustaining catastrophic damage. But the tactical victory of destroying American destroyers was overshadowed by the strategic failure of not destroying the carriers, by the recognition that American destroyer crews had demonstrated fighting spirit and tactical competence that exceeded what Japanese intelligence and doctrine had predicted. The transformation in Japanese perception of American destroyers that resulted from engagements like Samar was gradual but profound. Early war assessments had dismissed American destroyers as inferior to Japanese equivalents, noting that American torpedo tactics were crude, that American night fighting capabilities were inadequate, and that American destroyer crews lacked the training and determination that characterized Japanese naval forces. These assessments were based on early war engagements where Japanese destroyers had indeed achieved superior results and where American destroyer losses had been significant. But these assessments failed to account for American institutional capacity to learn from experience, to modify tactics based on what worked and what didn't, and to leverage technological advantages in radar and fire control that compensated for deficiencies in other areas. By 1944, American destroyers were operating with radar fire control that allowed accurate gunnery at night and in poor visibility, with improved torpedoes that were finally reliable after the disastrous torpedo failures of 1942-43, with tactical doctrines that emphasized coordinated attacks rather than individual ship actions, and with crew training that had been refined through combat experience that survivors had shared with new crews joining the fleet. The Fletcher-class destroyers that Japanese forces encountered in 1944-45 were fundamentally more dangerous than the destroyers they had fought in 1942, not because the ships had changed, many were the same vessels, but because the crews had become more skilled, the tactics had been improved, and the technological systems had been debugged and optimized for combat effectiveness. The symbolic significance of the 5-inch gun's sound extended beyond its immediate tactical effects to represent American industrial capacity and technological sophistication applied to naval warfare. Each Fletcher-class destroyer's 5-5-inch guns represented American manufacturing excellence, precision-machined weapons produced by companies like General Electric and Westinghouse, delivered to shipyards that were producing destroyers at rates of multiple ships per month, installed by workers who had been trained in specialized skills required for warship construction, and supplied with ammunition produced in such quantities that destroyers could fire hundreds of rounds per engagement without concerning themselves with conservation. The guns themselves were technological achievements, dual-purpose, mounts that could engage both surface and air targets, with fire control systems that incorporated radar ranging and mechanical computers that calculated firing solutions, with automatic loading mechanisms that allowed sustained high rates of fire, and with barrel cooling and maintenance procedures that allowed these weapons to function reliably in combat conditions that would have caused lesser systems to fail. Japanese destroyers carried powerful weapons, particularly their long-lance torpedoes, but Japanese industrial capacity could not match American production of destroyers, could not supply Japanese ships with radar fire control comparable to American systems, and could not replace Japanese destroyer losses at rates that maintained fleet strength as attrition accumulated. By 1944, Japanese destroyer numbers were declining, while American destroyer numbers were increasing, and this quantitative disparity was compounded by qualitative improvements in American destroyer effectiveness that made each ship more dangerous than its 1942 equivalent. The sound of American 5-inch guns became increasingly common in Pacific waters as more American destroyers entered service, as more Japanese targets came under American destroyer attack, and as American naval dominance became absolute through the combination of numbers and effectiveness that Japanese forces could not counter. The Fletcher-class destroyer's versatility made it valuable across every type of naval operation that characterized the Pacific War. In carrier task forces, destroyers provided anti-aircraft defense that helped protect carriers from Japanese air attacks, with their 5-inch guns and 40 and 20 anti-aircraft weapons creating defensive fire that Japanese aircraft had to penetrate to reach the carriers. In amphibious operations, destroyers provided naval gunfire support that suppressed Japanese beach defenses and supported Marine and Army forces advancing inland, with their 5-inch guns able to deliver accurate fire on targets indicated by shore fire control parties. In anti-submarine operations, destroyers hunted Japanese submarines using sonar and depth charges, protecting American shipping and contributing to the systematic destruction of Japanese submarine forces that ultimately rendered Japanese submarine warfare ineffective. The human element of destroyer effectiveness was as important as the technical characteristics of the ships themselves. Destroyer crews developed intense unit cohesion through living in close proximity, through sharing the dangers of combat, and through the leadership of commanding officers who were often the most capable and aggressive officers in their year groups. Destroyer command was competitive and was typically assigned to officers who had demonstrated tactical competence and leadership ability in previous assignments. The crews were younger on average than battleship or cruiser crews, were often more adaptable to new technologies and tactics, and developed informal procedures and workarounds that increased combat effectiveness beyond what official doctrine prescribed. Commander Evans and his crew aboard Johnston exemplified these characteristics. Evans had trained his crew to respond to orders instantly, had drilled them in damage control procedures until responses were automatic, and had created a culture where aggressive action was expected, and where crew members understood that their ship would fight until it could no longer fight rather than withdrawing when conditions became difficult. This culture was not unique to Johnston. It characterized American destroyer crews throughout the fleet, but it was particularly well developed aboard ships whose commanding officers made it explicit and whose combat experiences reinforced these values through successful outcomes that validated aggressive tactics. The Japanese recognition of American destroyer effectiveness manifested in tactical and operational adjustments that revealed how seriously Japanese forces took this threat. Japanese forces increasingly avoided situations where they would have to engage American destroyers without overwhelming advantages. Japanese night operations, which had been a Japanese strength early in the war, declined as American radar made night actions less favorable to Japanese forces, and Japanese naval operations became increasingly cautious as the risk of encountering American surface forces increased. The psychological impact of knowing that any encounter with American destroyers would likely result in sustained combat, where Japanese ships would take damage even if they ultimately prevailed, created operational constraints that affected Japanese decision-making throughout the war's latter phases. The battle off Samar, where Johnston and other destroyers had charged the Japanese battle line, became legendary in American naval history and was studied with intense interest by Japanese naval officers attempting to understand what had happened and how the outcome could have been prevented. Japanese after-action analyses acknowledged that American destroyer attacks had been more effective than doctrine predicted, that American destroyers had fought with determination that exceeded expectations, and that the tactical confusion created by having to engage close-range threats while attempting to maintain formation and advance toward the carriers had disrupted Japanese command and control in ways that contributed to the decision to withdraw. The analyses recommended tactical adjustments, better screening of Japanese capital ships, more aggressive engagement of American destroyers before they could close to torpedo range, improved communication and coordination. But these recommendations were difficult to implement in practice because they required resources and training that Japanese forces increasingly lacked. The Fletcher-class destroyer represented American naval architecture's successful balance of competing requirements, speed versus range, firepower versus survivability, specialization versus versatility. The ships were not optimal at any single mission, but were adequate at all missions, and this versatility made them invaluable as the war progressed and as American naval operations required forces that could perform multiple roles without requiring specialized vessels for each task. The 175 Fletcher-class destroyers that were commissioned during the war represented an enormous industrial achievement. Ships that were produced at rates that seem almost impossible, with multiple shipyards building vessels simultaneously, with supply chains that delivered components and materials reliably despite the ship's complexity, and with quality control that ensured these rapidly produced ships were combat-capable and reliable when delivered to the fleet. The sound of the 5-inch guns firing, which had been the symbolic representation of American destroyer effectiveness, continued echoing across the Pacific as American naval operations drove toward Japan itself. The sound became associated with American naval power, with the destroyers that screened carriers and bombarded shore positions and hunted submarines and engaged Japanese surface forces whenever they could be found. For Japanese forces, the sound became a harbinger of American presence, an announcement that American destroyers were engaging targets and that American naval power was asserting itself with firepower that Japanese forces could not ignore and often could not effectively counter. The epilogue of the Fletcher-class destroyer service is that these ships became the most numerous class of destroyer ever built by the United States, that they served not just through World War II, but through the Korean War and into the Cold War, and that their design influenced destroyer development for decades after their introduction. The ships that Japanese forces learned to fear during World War II were not the largest or most heavily armed American warships. Battleships and carriers were more powerful in absolute terms. But Fletcher-class destroyers were the warships that Japanese forces encountered most frequently, that engaged Japanese forces across the widest range of tactical situations, and that consistently demonstrated effectiveness that exceeded what their modest size and firepower would suggest was possible. The transformation that Fletcher-class destroyers represented was not just technical, but cultural. These were ships that embodied American naval culture's emphasis on aggressive action, that reflected American industrial capacity to produce capable weapons in overwhelming numbers, and that demonstrated American tactical flexibility in adapting to different combat situations without requiring specialized vessels for each mission type. The destroyers were weapon systems whose effectiveness derived from the combination of adequate technical characteristics, skilled crews, aggressive leadership, and institutional support that kept them operational and supplied regardless of distance from American bases. Commander Evans aboard Johnston charging the Japanese battle line was an extreme example of destroyer employment, but it was not an aberration. It was rather the logical extension of tactical doctrine and cultural values that characterized American destroyer operations throughout the Pacific War. The sound of American 5-inch guns firing at Samar as Johnston and her sister ships fought a battle they could not win, but that they fought anyway, because the carriers behind them had to be protected, because the mission demanded action regardless of personal survival, and because American naval culture valued aggressive combat over preservation of force when strategic imperatives required sacrifice, was ultimately the sound of American naval power asserting itself through the determination of crews who operated the most dangerous American warship of World War II. Dangerous not because of overwhelming individual capability, but because of the combination of adequate capability, overwhelming numbers, aggressive employment, and the refusal to accept defeat even when facing superior forces. The Fletcher-class destroyer terrified the Japanese Navy because it represented an opponent whose effectiveness could not be negated through tactical superiority or individual excellence, whose numbers could not be reduced through attrition faster than American shipyards produced replacements, and whose aggressive spirit meant that every encounter would be contested regardless of the tactical odds, that every American destroyer fought as if it were a capital ship rather than a light combatant, and that the cumulative effect of hundreds of destroyers operating with this mentality was naval dominance that Japan could not overcome despite individual tactical successes that Japanese forces occasionally achieved. The most dangerous American warship was dangerous because it was everywhere, because it fought with determination that tactical calculations could not predict, and because it represented American naval power at its most essential. Not battleships that could be countered and engaged, not carriers that could be hunted and destroyed, but rather the ubiquitous, aggressive, capable destroyers whose 5-inch guns cracked across Pacific waters, announcing that American naval forces were present, were engaged, and would not stop fighting until victory was achieved or until the ships were sunk beneath them.